Good morning, everybody. I should probably say good night after that 1.5 hour welcome session. Now, if you aren't tired, I am. So I'm going to ask you all to stand up. Just stand up, stretch your feet. This is the most important innovation in preventing deep vein thrombosis. And Sri Chitra, you should patent it. Now, I would say, bend your knees. Come on, guys, bend your knees. Sit down. Stand up. Sit down. Okay. How many of you are still asleep? Okay. All right. I want to first say, I'm going to talk about a part of my work that I've done with a lot of people around the world, including people here at the Achyuta Menon Center, HAPS, Raman Kutty is here, my good friend Vijay Kumar is not here, and there are others who worked on the project here. My interest for a long time has been in global health, and that's about half my work. I also want to say that the work that I've done is not only the efforts of many collaborators at my institute and around the world, probably about 1,000 of them, but also the support of my family. And I'm delighted to see my wife here and my sister here, who've driven from Cochin this morning at 4 o'clock and somehow managed to keep awake. So thank you. So I'm going to talk about, can we reduce the burden of cardiovascular disease by half? Why cardiovascular disease? We have 55 million deaths every year in the world, out of which 22 million are cardiovascular disease. And if we can reduce cardiovascular disease by half, that'll be the biggest public health achievement in history, not at any given time. But 80% of cardiovascular disease occurs in poor countries, where they don't have technology, where we don't have technology, where we don't have good health systems. So the challenge is double. So that's what I'm going to speak about today. During the period 1990 to 2013, in 1990, the world had 12.3 million deaths from cardiovascular disease. In 2013, there was 17.3 million deaths, which is a 41% increase in deaths from cardiovascular disease. Part of this, 25% of this, is because there were more people in the world. But 55% was because the world was getting older. People were getting older. So once you adjust for what is called age-specific cardiovascular disease death rate, it actually declined by 40%. This is why careful statistics are important. I'm going to give you the conclusion of my talk at the beginning, and then I'll go to the talk. There are 3 things that will make a big difference. First is avoid tobacco. The second is lower the bad cholesterol, what's called LDL cholesterol, and in fact within that there are subfractions like ApoB and ApoA and further subfractions. And the third one is blood pressure. If you lower blood pressure by 10 millimeters, not a huge amount, just 10 millimeters, which you can achieve with 2 blood pressure lowering drugs, you can reduce the risk by 25%. Most of this is independent of each other, so the 3 together can reduce cardiovascular disease substantially. So if there is one slide you have to be awake for, this is the slide. Now you can go to sleep. Now, everybody says we're beating tobacco. We know so much about tobacco. So it's going to be a forgotten issue. In the last century, at the bottom, 1900 to 1999, in that 100 years, 100 million people died from tobacco-related diseases. That's a lot of people. But in this century, from 2000 to 2099, 1 billion people will die from tobacco if we continue to smoke at the same rate as we did before. Now, part of this in the first 20 years is from people who are already smoking. But in the future, most of the deaths, for instance, from 2050 to 2099, 500 million will be from people who will start smoking, which is the children. So our tobacco policy should be focused not just on the smokers who are current, not just in the adults who could be smokers, but even on the children who are not yet born. So, lesson 1, prevention starts in childhood. We heard today of all the wonderful technologies in this institute. Honestly, if it was really that great, we don't need any other research institute in this country. Okay? It's fantastic. And if we can spread it. But remember one thing. Before patients become patients, patients are people. So the key issue in health is not just how you treat patients, but how do you prevent people becoming patients? The key issue is how do you prevent adults adopting bad habits when they're children and having those bad habits when they're older and getting into trouble. Here is a good example of a country, through simple public health measures, substantially reduced the impact of smoking. This is in the UK from the year 1960 to 2010. You will see in 1960, 42% of men would die by the time they were 70 years. By the year 2010, only 20% would die by the time they became 70. That is a 50% reduction. Now, most of that reduction came from deaths avoided due to smoking, which is the shaded area, from about 20 down to 4. There is some reduction in the rest, but the major reduction came from the simple intervention for which you don't need any patent, you don't need any technology, you just need good public health. Now, who won the Nobel Prize for tobacco? Anybody? Raise your hands. Anybody? Nobody. So the biggest advances in health are often things that are not recognized. And tobacco is one of those things which is the biggest killer in the world in history thus far. And large epidemiological study by Bradford Hill, Richard Dahl, my mentor Richard Pito, and the American Cancer Society was what did it. Now, my interest was on, can we apply what we know in the West to the rest of the world? Because we all know that South Asians have high rates of heart disease. Agreed? Agreed? Okay. So many people hypothesize that the reasons were different. South Asians were different in some way. We had wonderful genes that gave us more heart attacks. That was one of the theories. The other theory is we are small people, so our coronary arteries are smaller, so we'll get into trouble. And that we have special risk factors that nobody else had. We had to be special. The answer was no. But to prove that it was no, and we were the same as everybody, we did a study called InterHeart in 52 countries that took 14,000 people with heart attacks compared to 14,000 people with controls. And we looked at the effect of the risk factors on heart attack in every region of the world. And the second one was what proportion of heart attacks could be explained by risk factors. The answer to the first question was the impact of the risk factors was the same wherever you are. Whether you were in Trivandrum, in Timbuktu, or Temuco in Chile, the risk factors were the same. So there's nothing special about us. We're just as good or just as bad as anybody else. The second thing was what proportion of risk factors of a heart attack could be explained by known risk factors. Up to that, every textbook of cardiology started off with the opening sentence. We only know half the causes of heart disease. What that implies is we had to put a lot of effort into finding out new causes of heart disease. But what we found, as I'll show you in the next slide, is 90% of the causes of heart disease were already known. So our research had to change from trying to find new causes of heart disease to understand why the known risk factors today develop and what we can do about it. So you can see a simple epidemiological study that costs less than $10 million, done over about 8 years by the collaboration of about 300 people from 52 countries, dramatically changed the way we think about heart disease. And what we found was that 9 risk factors, abnormal lipids, ApoB by ApoA, which is bad molecules by good molecules, that's the simplest way, accounted by 54% of the global risk of heart attacks. One risk factor. Abnormal lipids was responsible for a very large part. Smoking was a big player, diabetes, hypertension. Both of these were probably underestimated because this is based on self-report, not on actual measurements. Abdominal obesity, if you look around the room, you'll find nobody who doesn't have abdominal obesity in this room. It is inherent in our culture. Psychosocial factors, people have ignored it because you can't work out, at least so far we haven't worked out, why should social isolation cause heart attacks? We can't work out the molecular basis in the RNA and the DNA mechanism of social mechanisms of disease. What this is telling you is health is a complex structure that has social, environmental, behavioral, biological, molecular medicine. So any health research program should encompass all of that. No one methodology is superior to another methodology. We need them all. And then lack of fruits and vegetables, lack of exercise, and alcohol, a tiny bit may be okay, a lot of it isn't. Now let me show you two slides, one on lipids, which is the ratio of ApoB by ApoA1. These are deciles. That means every 10% of the population. You'll see from a very low level to every 10% increase in the level of ApoB by ApoA1, there is an increase in risk. And that increase in risk is a straight line on a log scale. What does that mean? First, you don't have to measure lipids. Everybody has high lipids. Second, whatever your level, reduce your lipids. So that makes life easy. You don't need all those laboratories doing cholesterol tests. You don't need all these doctors counseling people, do you need high cholesterol or not? But fundamentally, it also means the concept of high cholesterol and low normal cholesterol is wrong. There is high cholesterol and high risk. There is low cholesterol and low risk. Now, these are data from the statin trials that proves what I've said using interventional data. So this is based on a massive meta-analysis done by my colleagues at the University of Oxford, where we collaborated. And you see that no matter what your level of LDL is, 2.5 to 3, 3 to 3.5, over 3.5, there is a risk reduction in the risk of future cardiovascular disease events. How many of you are familiar with this kind of plots? Just raise your hands. Okay, looks like 2/3 aren't. Let me tell you what this is. This is odds ratios, hazards ratios, and anything to the left of this line of unity means the risk is lowered. The bold dot means that's the average risk. So this is about 0.8, and the line here is your confidence limits. So that's the number, 0.78, 0.69 to 0.89. So that is the uncertainty around where your estimate is. That's actually quite precise. To say 20% risk reduction, 0.8 means 1 minus 0.8. I'm spending a minute on this so that you're all with me as I will use this concept throughout my talk. Now, the same thing with blood pressure. There is no threshold at which the risk of blood pressure is zero, risk associated with zero. Of course, there will be one, because if it's too low, people will be dizzy and they will fall down. And you can see, especially in Asia, the association with blood pressure and outcome is high. So somewhere around 110, 120 may be acceptable, but as you increase your risk doubles. So again, that means lower your blood pressure irrespective of where you are. Of course, how you lower it will depend. If it's just about 130, you use lifestyle methods. If it's 160 or 180, you use drugs. But the decision to lower your blood pressure is not dependent on your blood pressure level. These are fundamental departures in the thinking in epidemiology and in public health. But they are being accepted. We did the same thing for strokes. We did a study initially of 6,000 people with my colleague Martin O'Donnell, who's now the dean in Galway, but he was my fellow for 8 years. And then this went on to 28,000 people. And again, we found that 5 simple risk factors predicted 90% of strokes, whether or not they were ischemic strokes or intracerebral hemorrhages. Now, these two are what we call case control studies. How many of you know what a case control study is? Just raise your hands. Come on, guys, more of you should know. Gosh, you're at the pinnacle of a research institute and you don't know what a case control study is? Maybe the first thing you should do is have a course on research methodology. Okay, what is a case control study? You have people who have got a case and you match them with people who don't have the disease. And then you compare what happens to them, what their risk factors are, and others. But the problem with that is if you already know you've had a heart attack, you might change your lifestyle. You might stop smoking. You might start to eat the right diet. You might start to exercise. So there is a potential of what is called a bias from that. So you can't be sure that what you've got from a case control study is the truth. But you have to do that to get funded to do the real study. So that took us 10 years to get to starting the real study. And then we did a study called PURE, which stands for Prospective Urban Rural Epidemiology Study, in 27 countries from 5 continents, including India. And in India, Trivandrum is the center here. Raise your hands, the people in PURE. Well done, great job. You're one of our greatest. And you have 6,000 people already followed for 14 years here. So we have 202,000 people in the study, all continents except Australia and Antarctica. This will avoid the biases of a case control study, but also by having so many countries, we can test the hypothesis. Do the risk factors, are they the same or different in different parts? It can also test the hypothesis that certain environmental factors, because you need communities that are diverse to test environmental factors, whether they matter or not. You can't do it on individuals. You can measure cholesterol in individuals. So the questions we asked is 80% of the world lives in low and middle income countries. They have more cardiovascular disease. Is it because they have more risk factors? Maybe. Is it because the healthcare systems are poorer in the low and middle? Incidentally, LMIC stands for low and middle income countries, LIC stands for low income countries, and HIC stands for high income countries. So are the healthcare systems weaker, and is access to good care poorer? So the first thing we did was something very simple. We measured the risk factors in these 200,000 people, and in the high-income countries, we actually saw higher risk factors. And in the low-income countries, we saw lower risk factors. But when you look at the cardiovascular disease rates, we saw a paradox. The rich countries had lower cardiovascular disease rates, and the poor countries had higher cardiovascular disease days, 60% higher. And if you look at mortality, again, you can see a big difference, 370% higher risk of cardiovascular disease, of death from any cause. Now, there's a clue here. If you look at non-major cardiovascular disease, what this is things like angina, early arrhythmias. These are being detected in rich countries like Canada and the US and the UK earlier, and they're being treated. Then here, this emphasizes the importance of clinical medicine. There has always been a debate which matters more, prevention or treatment. That debate is silly. The real debate is we need both. And so far in India, we have focused on treatment. We have superb clinicians who regurgitate known information. I didn't say known evidence. Half the things we teach our students are wrong. The problem is we don't know which half. So, this is one paradox. Now, we also looked at the causes of death in different parts of the world. So, in high-income countries like Canada or Sweden or the US, 23% of the deaths were from cardiovascular disease, but 55% were from cancers. These are recent data as of last year. So cancer is now the number one problem in many of the rich countries. It's no longer cardiovascular disease. You take poor countries, like low-income countries, 43% is cardiovascular disease, only 15% is cancer. These are dry numbers that are not exciting until you start to think about it. What does it mean? In rich countries, we controlled cardiovascular disease. In poorer countries, as certain habits are increasing, like smoking, more risk factors for cancers like HPV, untreated H. pylori, hepatitis B, cancer will increase. 20 years from now, the picture in low-income countries will look like the picture in high-income countries. So we can't wait for us to not only beat the epidemic of cardiovascular disease, we have to prevent the future epidemic of cancers. So there's a lot of implications here. Now, right now in the world, we then said, what are the things that really matter in causing cardiovascular disease? So you have what is called the risk, doubling the risk, tripling the risk. I think you all understand, don't you? Okay? But there is something called population attributable risk, which means if in a population, a given risk factor is only 5%, but that same risk factor in another population is 20%, the impact of that risk factor becomes 4 times as big. Are you with me? Okay, still awake? All right. And so you'll see the number one risk factor in the world is hypertension. Very plain, simple blood pressure. What does it cost to measure blood pressure? Next to nothing. Who can measure blood pressure? A high school student can measure blood pressure. You don't need a health professional. We have at least a dozen good drugs for blood pressure measurement, and we have many lifestyle interventions. So this is one that we can control, but we are poor, absolutely abysmal in blood pressure control worldwide. The next is lipids. The third, which has been neglected by the West, because it doesn't happen in the West, is household indoor pollution from unclean fuels. Kerala has a big problem still with it. Tobacco, poor diet, but it's not what we usually think of poor diet, low education, abdominal obesity, diabetes, and so on. Now let me now switch to air pollution. What we did is a study, my colleague, a medical geographer, Perry Heistad, and Michael Brower from the University of British Columbia, we collaborated with them. By having Pure in 27 countries, in 1,000 centers, we have variations in air pollution. You can't study it in one community alone. So what we did is we got data from satellite images. NASA has these satellites going around the world, partly for surveillance of all kinds of things, and we won't go into that, but there's some good that comes out of it. They dump their data related to air pollution onto the web. You can get it if you know how it. And these things go around, and there are so many of them. Every community in the world is surveyed about a dozen times a day. So you can get daily or even hourly air pollution in every community in the world by extracting data from NASA and working with health geographers. Using that, what we found was for every 10 microgram per increase in particulate matter 2.5, that is the tiny particles you inhale with air pollution, the risk of cardiovascular disease goes up 3%. That is enormous. Same thing, cardiovascular disease, 5% increase, it accounts for 14% of the deaths in the world, or heart attacks in the world. And same for strokes. It's strokes where the biggest thing is. Now, if you take China, it's 7 times increase. Now, indoor air pollution, ignore Model 1, Model 2, these were made for statistical things. And when you do the same thing, you will see there's an increase in cardiovascular disease events, heart attacks, strokes, non-cardiovascular disease deaths, and non-accidental mortality. But how did we measure indoor pollution? Just a simple question. What kind of fuel do you use for your cooking and heating? It's a crude question. It's not as precise as what we did for ambient air pollution. So now, in 1,000 households around the world, we're actually measuring it by putting monitors on people, so men and women, and we got monitors in the house, and we are measuring it. And in a few years, we'll actually have much better quantitative information. And I think indoor pollution is a major risk factor for disease. You've all heard of global warming. Who's heard of global warming? Come on. Come on. Are the others not reading the papers or watching TV? Okay. Well, so we've used the study where we have 1,000 centers right across the world in different climates to study the effect of climate prospectively. And what we found was a U-shaped relationship. If you live in a country or a region of the world where the average temperature is under 20 degrees, then for every 1 degree increase, your mortality is reduced 4%. So actually, global warming is good for you if you live in Canada or Sweden or in Finland or Alaska. But if you live in a hot temperature, 1 degree increase over 20 degrees increases mortality by 10%, twice as much. Because most of the world lives in climates over 20 degrees, the impact will be greatest. So a country like India, a state like Kerala, this is where we're going to have the biggest impact from global warming. The situation is greater in poorer households. Why? They've constructed less well to deal with it. They don't have air conditioning. And it's there in people already who's had cardiovascular disease and those who live in warm temperatures. I'll now come to the area that every one of you will be interested in it because you would like to do something about it, and probably, at least I hope you do. And I'm not going to talk about tobacco. You know smoking tobacco is bad. You know activity is good, but I'm going to talk about diet. How many of you want to hear about diet? Good. These questions are a check that you haven't fallen asleep. Okay. Now, so I'm going to talk about salt and diet. I'm not going to talk about alcohol because every one of you knows what answer you want, and I don't want to contradict you. So I'll talk about salt and diet. The conventional theory is the more animal fats you eat, especially saturated fats, will raise your LDL in your cholesterol and will cause coronary heart disease. This is the wisdom drummed into us by the WHO and the American Heart Association. It was based on one study that was never replicated by Ansel Keys. where and this is called ecological data, where he estimated from six countries what the amount of fats they ate, and then he used certain mortality data, and then he compared it. So he found the data in between 45 and 50, and 55 and 59, and here is this: more fats, more cardiovascular disease. And the correlation here is 0.97. I have never in my life seen a correlation of 0.97 on human data. That should be the first flag. There's a problem here. The second is when you read the paper, they don't tell you how they measured diet. When you read the paper, they don't tell you how they selected the population. When you read the paper, they don't tell you how they ascertained the events. Today, such a paper would never get published. But this influenced the policy in the US to a huge extent. But then two people from the NIH, Yerushalmi and Hillebo, reanalyzed these people data. And they said, there were data then, not on 6 countries, on 22 countries. And Ansel Keys chose the 6 countries that fitted his graph. And these are the data, the original data from the 22 countries, and the correlation is extremely weak. There is an association, but it's about 0.2. This again tells you in science we need replication, independent replication. We need careful description of methodology and validation. There was then a paper from Europe where another group analyzed data from 41 European countries with better methods and actually found the other way around. The more fats you eat, you are better off. So you can have your ghee. Don't have to put it away. And we published from Pure the same thing. Fats are actually neutral or slightly protective, not harmful. I have been vilified for this by the WHO and the AHA, but increasing data now are supporting it. There are many times in my life I've been a villain. This is one of those things. But science progresses by challenging ideas, not by making sure you twist your data to conform to ideas. That's what you got to do. And then the best approach is to do a randomized trial. So there are 6 randomized trials. These are not the number of people, these are the number of heart disease events. In those in whom saturated fats was reduced, there were 356 events. In those in the control groups, it's 346 events, absolutely neutral. These data have been ignored consistently. And this is by a Cochrane meta-analysis. I had nothing to do with it. Incidentally, the other people working with Ansel Keys from Minnesota did a large randomized trial. Ivan Franz did it. It was never published. After Ivan Franz died, his son found stacks and stacks of file in the basement. So he called the NIH and said, I know you funded this trial. I'd like to give you the data. So the data went to the NIH and was analyzed and published. And it was published in the BMJ about 4 years ago. Ramsey was the first author. It showed an increase in mortality in the intervention group. So you can see scientists, if they don't get a result they like, keep quiet about it. If they get a result they like, they shout from the rooftops. And today, instead of shouting on the rooftop, you collect 1 million miles in frequent flyer points. Now, what is the real culprit? The real culprit is carbohydrates. And this may be why we're having a problem in India and in Kerala. These are data from the Pure study that showed this is the level of carbohydrate intake. So of the diet, if you consume anything more than 55% of your diet as carbohydrates, your mortality rate increases. Note at the bottom end, we're not seeing that, once you go beyond 55%, you're not seeing a further decrease. So this new fad of removing carbohydrates completely from your diet also has no basis. So extremes don't matter. I showed these data to my grandmother some 10 or 15 years ago when she was alive. She said, "Why are you wasting all your time doing this research? I could have told you, don't eat too much of this or too little of this. Moderation is what you need." So now, here are actual data. This is refined products. Here's mortality, and these are the hazard ratio for various levels of refined wheat intake. You will see with each itty-bitty little bit increase per day, mortality is increasing. Same thing with cardiovascular mortality, non-cardiovascular mortality, major cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, especially stroke. If you look, there is something called glycemic index. What it means is you can eat carbohydrates, but some carbohydrates, the body absorbs more glucose. Fair enough, you know that, like brown rice, or our millets, like bajra and various other things. And you will see the higher your glycemic index, the risk goes up. Now, in India, soon after independence, we had a crisis. We had famine in the country. The food was short. And we just had the Green Revolution. So we had to produce cheap food and provide it to the masses inexpensively. And that's what the ration shops did. They provided cheap rice. Traditional whole grains was not intake reduced. And as you know, our Prime Minister has persuaded the UN this year to call it the Year of the Millet. So bajra, ragi, these things, coarse grains may be the way to go. Now, let's come to blood pressure. And there is huge controversy on sodium. The more sodium you take, you're meant to have higher blood pressure. But look at this. When you do trials, and there are 34 studies, 3,000 people, you will get a reduction of 2.5 millimeters in an intense setting where people are followed, vigorously, advised all the time. And the data at 6 months, you get 2.5 millimeters. In those who don't have a hypertension, it is a 1.5 millimeter change. Those who have hypertension, it's a 3.2 millimeter change. And a 1 millimeter difference in blood pressure equates 2.5% change in CVD. So in this group, that's about a 10% difference. That's sizable. In this group, it's much smaller. If we assume sodium has no other effect. Let me ask you all a question, and I hope every one of you will get the answer right. Have you heard of the action potential? Just raise your hands, guys. You haven't heard of the action potential? And is sodium important in the action potential? Yeah. So if you soak your sodium down into your boots, do you think your cells will function normally? So this is an example of public health policy driven by the tyranny of epidemiologists. This then brings me to another point. Science is not based on one method alone. It has to be coherence and an integration of information from different methods. And I'll show you more data why this story is wrong. Here is another study, two very good studies funded by the NIH. So what they did, they called TOP 1 and TOP 2 trials. These are people with borderline hypertension. So at 6 months, they lowered sodium by 1.2 grams per day, blood pressure reduced 3. But they managed to keep most of the difference out to 3 years. But you will see the difference in blood pressure was attenuated to 1.2, which means the body gets used to that. So this level of change took enormous effort in the context of a trial. And it dissipates over time. Now, but the neglected electrolyte is potassium. Higher potassium is associated with lower risk. And the overall is more potassium, your blood pressure also goes down to a lesser extent, but it still goes down. And in the end, it's mainly in hypertensives and non-hypertensives. But our goal is not just blood pressure. Blood pressure is a vehicle, a vehicle to reduce heart attacks and strokes. So what we need is studies on heart attacks and strokes. So we did some epidemiological studies. This is the first study we did. 29,000 high-risk people followed for 56 months. And much to our surprise, we saw a U-shaped relationship. Too little was bad for you, too much was bad for you. And this is where the average in the US is. And in fact, India is also close, just a bit above that. Canada is about that. China is way out here. Central Asia is way out there. So actually the average sodium intake in Kerala, in India, in the US and Canada the same. But then if you say the average is okay, then what does the organizations that are advocating for low salt do? They have to go home. And that's been the other battle. So my work has been criticized on that. But there are 29 studies now, independent studies, that confirm this. But more important than that, you need randomized trials. These are tough to do. Randomized trials of lifestyle are very tough to do. But thankfully, Bruce Neal from Australia did a very good study where he substituted standard salt, sodium salt, with about 50% lower sodium and put potassium instead. And what he found was there was a reduction in stroke by 14%, CVD by 13%, death by 12%. But despite the fact they reduced sodium in the diet, in the salt by 50%, the actual sodium reduction was only 10% because people compensated for it by adding salt to their diet. And the big difference was potassium. So that suggested but didn't prove that sodium was the less important component, but potassium was a more important component. And potassium comes from many other things we think that are good, like fruits and vegetables. So, but there was another study in which, again, done in China by Bruce Neal was a co-author. And in this study, they did something. They had people where there was a salt substitute, that is this line, or usual thing, and salt substitute reduced the risk by 40% of cardiovascular events. And the same thing with mortality. But then they had and salt substitute was potassium increasing, some decrease in sodium. But it doesn't tell you which one matters. But then they had another arm in which they only did sodium reduction. And it was neutral, as you can see, on cardiovascular events, but an increase in mortality in the sodium event. This was published in Nature. The previous one was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, highly respectable journals. These types of studies are essential to change knowledge. So, Auden once said, where is the knowledge in all that information? Where is the wisdom in all that knowledge? Today in medicine, we impart information. We don't necessarily impart knowledge. We'll only know whether that information is reliable through research. And we'll only know how to, once we decipher what matters, on how to use it by bringing in the social sciences into it. This is now telling you medicine can't be an isolated biological specialty. It has to be integrated with genomics at one end, with the environment at another end, social context at another end, and economics at another end. Now, so I'll skip that. Now, you all know there are drugs that work, and this is the last part of my talk. Once you have a heart attack or a stroke, and how many of you know of somebody who had a heart attack or stroke? Just raise your hands. Oh boy, what is that telling us? It's a very common condition in Kerala. There are 4 drug classes where if you give after a heart attack or stroke, it reduces future events, death, heart attacks, and strokes. And I'd say I've been part of the story of generating the evidence. But if you look at the use of an antiplatelet agent, which is aspirin, in the rich countries, only about 2/3 of people get it. And aspirin is cheap, okay? So why, even in the rich countries, only 2/3 get it? And in the poor countries here, less than 10% get it. And if you take beta blockers, which are not expensive, you will see this gradient. If you take ACE inhibitors, you'll see that gradient, 50% in rich countries, about 5% in poor countries. And if you can look at statins, you will see virtually zero in the poor countries. But these are things that work. And today's, all these drugs are generic, they're inexpensive. There's no excuse not to use them. So by using simple drugs, we can make a big difference. Now, I hypothesized in 2003, published in The Lancet, that if you use all four together, you could reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease by 70 to 80%. A year later, two scientists from the UK, Nick Wald and Malcolm Law, published what I think is one of the most brilliant analyses of epidemiological data in the BMJ, and they coined the term polypill. I use the term combination pill. Polypill is more sexy, so always go with the sexy term. So they did, but the end result was same. Both were theoretical analyses. So in 2003 and 4, the concept was born. We did studies, and as did others, on showing that the polypill reduced risk factors. No surprise. It's got a statin, it's got blood pressure lowering agents, it's got to do that. Then we did the first big trial of 12,700 people on the concept where one arm got a statin, another arm got a blood pressure lowering, and a third arm got both, and a fourth arm got neither. And that showed benefit. We published 3 papers in the New England Journal side by side. It is the proudest issue of the New England Journal I have, to have 3 papers in the same issue. And then 2019, colleagues in Iran, on their own, developed another polypill, and they published in The Lancet showing benefit. Then in 2020, we had developed now a polypill with the help of an Indian company, Cadila, and we did a study of 5,700 people, and published that in the New England Journal 2 years back, and that also showed benefit. So now we have 3 independent studies that showed benefit. Am I taking too long? You're looking fidgety. Can I go on? Yeah. Okay. And more recently, Professor Valentin Fuster from Mount Sinai, New York, working with people in Spain, SCTIMST in Madrid, did a secondary prevention trial showing benefit. So we now have 4 independent trials in a wide range of patients in different parts of the world that showed benefit. And then we did what is called a meta-analysis, where we brought the data together. And then we submitted an application to the WHO, and they approved its inclusion in the essential medicines list. What is the implication of that? That means governments around the world will be persuaded to adopt polypills within their national formularies, and in many countries, they will provide it for free. So potentially, this could have a big effect over time. So this is the meta-analysis that shows a 37% reduction at the end of 5 years. This is both with or without aspirin. This is the one with aspirin. You will see hazard ratio 0.55. That is a 45% reduction event, nearly halving. Isn't that great? With one pill, you can halve the risk, and reduces death, it reduces heart attacks, it reduces strokes, it prevents revascularization. And if you prevent non-fatal heart attacks, strokes, and revascularizations, you not only are benefiting the patient, you're saving money. So when we did cost effectiveness analysis, it was either neutral or it even saved money. There are very few interventions in medicine that saves lives and saves money. And this is one of them. So who would I give a polypill to? One, clearly those who've got vascular disease, a heart attack, stroke, or peripheral artery disease. Those with diabetes, those with hypertension, or other high-risk individuals over the age of 55 or 60. And remember, the biggest risk factor for heart disease and strokes is what? How many of you think it's tobacco? Raise your hands. You know it's a trick question. That's why nobody's. Sorry. Sorry? Exactly. Good. That's a very smart answer. Cholesterol. Actually, the biggest risk for heart disease is age. If you age, you've got an accumulation of the effects of risk factors over time. So to choose somebody to get a poly pill, you just need a blood pressure cuff, ask them a question, do you have diabetes or something? And you ask them their age. Or did you have a heart attack? This starts to make prevention simple, inexpensive, and incredibly effective. Now, this is an analysis done by David Watkins from IHME, Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, that Chris Murray directs. And he's estimated that if those who should get the poly pill only use it, only 50% of it use it, 2 million deaths will be avoided each year. And 3 times as many people will avoid a heart attack or stroke. But if they go to 80% coverage, 4 million deaths will be avoided every year, and 3 times as many heart attacks and strokes will be prevented. That's not peanuts. That is serious stuff. So we've estimated by 2050, only if half the people who should get a poly pill, they'll have 50 to 100 million premature deaths will be avoided, and between 150 to 300 million heart attacks and strokes will be avoided. That is a big global impact. This will probably dwarf any impact of the 30 Nobel Prizes that were given to people in genetics. Simple intervention. So our challenge now is not the evidence. Our challenge is to translate the evidence into practice. That is the challenge. So I just want to say, I'm really proud of the fact that the WHO last 2 weeks ago included the poly pill in the essential medicines list. It's a very, very important discovery, as it will save both lives and money. Hypertension, we have the same problem. The control of hypertension, which is this is the prevalence of hypertension. This is those who are treated for hypertension. This is the control. This is a rich country like Canada, the US, or Sweden, and you will see 50% have hypertension. Most of them are treated, but they're treated poorly, and only 20% have control. Go to the other extreme, to low-income countries or low-middle-income countries. About the same rate of hypertension, but those who are treated are somewhat lower, but the rates of control is only 10%. What a tragedy. We have so many good medications we can use to treat them. And so what we need is a new mechanism of delivery. A doctor-based approach has failed in prevention. In Kerala, we have high rates of vaccination. How much of that vaccination is given by doctors? Very low. Most of them are given by health workers. I believe they're called ASHA workers. Is that right, Ramankuti? Am I got it right? I'm learning from you. Anyway, so what China did is they did a large randomized trial of 34,000 people in 326 villages. They randomized these villages to have what they call the barefoot doctor, about 2 or 3 years of training, versus usual care. And what they found was blood pressure difference between the usual care, that means whatever the people had and they went to the doctor, they had that level of systolic blood pressure, and those who were treated by the barefoot doctors, 23 millimeter decrease in blood pressure. Have you ever heard of an intervention that reduces blood pressure by 23 millimeters systolic? And this is on not small numbers. This is not on selected people. This is on a huge number of people. But now, what did they find? They found that the death rate or the rate of cardiovascular disease was 1.6% per year in the intervention group and 2.4% in the treated group, and that's a 33% risk reduction. And there was a reduction in heart attacks and strokes and heart failure, cardiovascular deaths, all deaths, and this was published in The Lancet a few months ago. We published a similar paper, not as big as this, in Colombia and Malaysia, showing the same effect on blood pressure and lipids, but not on mortality because it's a much smaller and shorter study. So we have the tools, we need to change it. I wanted to start go back to the very beginning. The US, Canada, many of the Western countries have done a remarkable job in controlling cardiovascular disease, despite having a haphazard approach. This is cardiovascular disease mortality rate from 1958 to 2010 in the US. Look at how markedly low it was. Look at strokes. It's gone down markedly. This is controlling for aging of the population and increase. Cancers, though, peaked in 1990. It's coming down. And if we extrapolated this graph, cancers are coming down. It shows even cancer is preventable. Heart disease, though, and strokes have plateaued off, so we need to do something more. So I'll conclude by saying we need interventions at different levels. Societal policies such as air pollution, climate change, food policies by which we get the right information, but also make the right foods available, the built environment, social cohesion and structure, individual behaviors like diet, mainly a focus on reducing carbs, especially refined carbs, increasing fruits and vegetables. Incidentally, nuts are good for you, fish is probably, dairy is good for you. There is no evidence that whole-fat dairy is bad for you. Yet we have this huge industry in the West on low-fat milk. It has zero evidence for it. Metabolic risk factors I've talked about, and use of cost-effective treatments to control blood pressure, lipids, diabetes, and prevention. And the polypill is one part of it. It's not the entire solution. It's one part of it. So I will conclude with two slides. First is something the Chief Minister would have loved. It was said by the father of the philosophy of communism, not the terrible things communism has done. He says, our task is not to simply describe the world, but to change it. Our task is to translate, and that's what Rajan and others want to do with this new initiative in research. But as I stand here and take credit for this work is the result of about 300 people in my group and about 1,000 people elsewhere. And these are the people in my core group who are responsible for it. And I'm really indebted to their work. And so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Salim Yusuf, for that wonderful talk. And I'm sure there must be a couple of questions, but this has already set you thinking.
There are a few questions.
Yes. This already must have set you thinking, especially when you're going to take your lunch, your talk on the carbs and on the fat content. So I think we will just accept a couple of questions. Yes.
You talked about the lifestyle where you talk about, the exercise, and of course you give, huge things on the food part also. And tobacco, of course, places to places it is reducing. I was, throughout the time I was thinking, like, why did you keep quiet on sleep? Sleep.
Oh,
Sleep is a big thing. I was wondering the whole time, why did you keep quiet on the sleep?
why did I not discuss sleep?
Oh yes.
Well, my talk probably put almost all of you to sleep. So, and if
Time to time, I think
if I went on for 5 more minutes, we'd be hearing snoring. So the answer is there isn't enough data on sleep. We have researched sleep and we published probably 4 or 5 papers on it. First, sleep is hard to measure. You can ask somebody, what time do you go to bed? That doesn't mean when they start to sleep. What time do you wake up? That's one. You don't know enough about the quality of sleep either. In order to understand sleep, we need some simple measurement methods that can be used on a wider population scale. So sleep likely is an important factor, but right now we don't have adequate data simply because we don't have the right technology yet to measure sleep properly and the types of sleep and the quality of sleep. So you're right, it's an important area.
So I'm a sleep scientist. That's why I was wondering to hear something on this aspect. Yeah.
We
Thank you very
published
much.
a few
Yeah.
papers on it,
But
but
of course, in the recent time, I mean, in the last couple of years,
yeah.
lots of things are coming in the CBD
Yep.
with the various kinds of sleep deprivation. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
If there are no questions, I would like to ask one.
Sure, please come up here.
The prevalence, because a lot of residents ask me this question, the prevalence of CAD in India, or for that matter, Kerala, versus what is there in the US West. Because people keep saying this is having an, moving up and through, but is it substantiated by data? The, yeah, so what the question was that is the prevalence of CAD in India, and for that matter in Kerala, is it much higher than the West, as some people say, and is it substantiated by data, or is it that the West has still more and we don't have so?
Okay, I think I want to make a little change in your question by making a distinction. Prevalence means how many people in this room have CVD. But the number of people who have CVD depends on 2 factors. How many actually get CVD, how many die from CVD, and the remaining people who live with CVD. So the prevalence is not a good measure of the problem of CVD. A better measure is incidence of CVD. There are very few data from India, large cohort studies, 10, 15 years follow-up. Now, the PURE study, which we're doing, including Trivandrum, we have data. We published our Indian data last year in the European Heart Journal. It shows India does have higher rates, higher CVD incidence than countries like the US, UK, Canada. But so do other countries. Africa actually has the highest rates of highest incidence of CVD, especially strokes. Also, the pattern of CVD is different. In Africa and in China, it's strokes. In India, it's heart attacks. And I don't know why that dichotomy is there. So there is a difference in that pattern. And right now, we're writing a 14-year follow-up paper. And COVID has really delayed us because the follow-up has been devastated all over the world. So tracking everybody down is taking an extra 2 years. But the short answer to your question is India does have higher CVD prevalence compared to Western populations. But remember, the Western populations, 2 things have happened. One is there are good treatments, so prevalence doesn't tell you because you treat well and so more people live. Okay, and the second thing is CVD incidence in the West has come down dramatically, as I showed you in that previous slide. So I hope I've answered your question.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you, sir. So you mentioned about dietary fat, the myth.
Yeah, introduce yourself so that.
So my name is Dr. Jijo Raj, scientist in polymer medical devices in Sri Chitra. Sir, it was great to hear that milk fat or the dietary fat is very good for us, but also it's a concern is the oil fat. For example, in Kerala, the prevalence of cardiovascular disease, one of our own institute studies shows that the age, most of the population getting cardiovascular diseases, the age is reduced by 10 years. So that the average age
is lower
by 10
sure,
years.
Sure.
So, and one reason associated with this is also the heavy metals in the oil that we use in Kerala, the coconut oil, and also what could be the, is there a real influence of that, the cooking oil that we use in the population? Because different part of India, they have different oil, and the West probably.
Okay,
olive
I
oil
got your
is,
question, so
yeah.
that, you know, it is true that Indians get heart attacks and strokes at a younger age, but so did people in America and England 20 years back. So it's a time transition, you know. So in the beginning of an epidemic, people get the disease earlier. As the epidemic matures and you learn how to control it, it's pushed out a decade or two. So India is somewhere in the middle of the epidemic, and my guess is we will see that age dropping. The second thing is the reason why people get disease at an earlier age is more risk factors that are not controlled. So we all agree that in India and Kerala, at least till a few years ago, and even now, risk factors are not controlled. Now, as smoking rates come down, we're going to see that shift. We're going to see the disease being pushed out. Smoking is the number one cause of heart attacks in the very young, under the age of 40. Now, I don't know enough about heavy metals in coconut oils. I think, look, a small amount of coconut oil is fine. But what I would say is avoid processed oils or processed fats, like which has something called trans fats. Those are bad. Anything that's processed or trans fats, they're not natural. So let's just, I mean, humanity has lived without processed food for, I don't know, how many centuries? 5,000 BC, 10,000 BC. So I would avoid the processed things like dalda and all that kinds which are processed. But natural ghee should be okay, a little bit, but not too much. And I don't know about the heavy metals. And you know, if it's a problem here, my challenge to you is go and research it. And tell me the answer in 5 years.
I think what he probably also asked is that whether coconut oil and saturated fats is okay for as a medium. Typically coconut oil and palm oil, the saturated ones.
Okay.
That's a question that comes from the Kerala audience.
Okay, now saturated fats increases total cholesterol, but the entire risk doesn't come from total cholesterol. First, we know LDL and HDL matters. So as you have more saturated fats, your LDL goes up a little bit. I had slides, we published papers in the Lancet, but your HDL also goes up. So your ratio of LDL to HDL actually remains flat. But even LDL, as I said, it is the ApoB, which is an indicator of the small particles that matter. Actually, the more saturated fat you take, your small particles go down, and it's the large particles that go up. And this is work we're doing with Dr. Krause out in Beverly and Berkeley. And so you need to understand the composition of the blood thing. Now, what increases LDL, ApoB, and small dense LDL is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates increase everywhere, and it lowers HDL as well. So there is a story around it that is evolving. Now, 30 years ago, when the story was simply LDL, the recommendations by WHO and AHA, not their fault, they acted on the best information, was reduce animal fats without distinguishing between all of these. And you all know that once you have the evidence, the people whose information you contradict, they fight back. They criticize you, you're a villain. Then as other people's data come and replicate your results, gradually the field shifts. The field is now shifting. The field has to shift a lot to make a difference to the guidelines. Guidelines don't change overnight. You need study after study after study to get it. I've been on the salt story for 15 years, been criticized very heavily on the fat thing, but now increasingly people are shifting towards it. So, but avoid processed food. That's given. oils in modest amounts, don't drown yourself in oil, and carbohydrates is what you take care of. But if you had a plate of food, half of it should be fresh vegetables, not starchy vegetables. A quarter may be whole grains, carbohydrates, wheat, rice, and a quarter could be some kind of protein, dal, eggs, chicken, fish, whatever. So think of food as how much of your plate should be. But your plate should be this small, but not big. So one of the first things you do is you start off with a small plate. Yes, madam.
The last, yes.
I love these questions. Don't cut them off.
Thank you, sir. I'm Indu from community medicine. Since it is all about translation, translating all these evidence into the daily practice in the Kerala dining table, what can be the amount of cereals, let it be rice or wheat, in terms of grams? When we say plate, you said it should be a small pot. I mean, I think further quantification and engaging the community at large, how much rice, how much wheat, probably in the Indian context.
Yeah, I'm not a nutrition scientist. I'm a cardiologist and epidemiologist, but I have nutritionists working with me. Most nutrition guidelines are percent of calories from source A, source B, source 3. You can convert it back into grams. So I have to go back to my papers to tell you grams. But I can tell you, when I gave you the plate idea, is giving you a relative idea of how much you should eat of each.
6 ounces, like 6 slices of bread, that's the American diet.
Oh no, that's too much. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, those are the ways in which countries and guidelines have
Yeah,
translated.
no, like,
I think your one of the slides said something like beyond 50 grams, but that is carbohydrate.
yeah. Now I can tell you that is percent of energy. It's not 60 grams. Yeah. Now I can tell you for salt, because people ask me how much salt is all these millimoles or grams. About 1 to 2 teaspoons of sodium is okay, preferably to keep it around 1.5. Over 2 teaspoons, and this is not dumping it onto your food. This includes what you use in your cooking. The other part of sodium is the hidden sodium in processed food, because you cannot quantify, you just don't know how much there is. So, well, any other? Oh, yeah, there is one question. Why don't we take that? And if there is any other, I'll take one more and we'll take it at the lunch break. I always know that the diet part elicits most questions.
I'm Dr. Vijayalakshmi, doing my PDF at Computational Biology and Bioinformatics. And nutrimetabolomics is my area, research area. And one aspect that we generally do not see is the gaseous matter that is being produced in the human system. Means it might be due to the metabolic process by the gut microbiome,
Yes.
right? And mainly because most of the CVD, people who have had heart attack or who feel like having a heart attack, the first thing that they will be telling is, I have a gas being accumulated, and that pressure is giving me pain in my chest. So that is one main response that we have seen in any person who has who's associated with CVD tells. But there is not much research that is, or as of what I know, not much thought is being given about the amount of, we talk about ions like sodium level, potassium level and all, we talk about carbohydrates, we talk about lipids, but then the gaseous matter, that doesn't come anywhere in the surveillance when we go to a doctor, or we do tell them and they give us medicine temporarily, but then...
Okay, I think I've got your question. You're asking a good question. The problem in science or in anything is you have to measure something to study it. At the moment, we don't have any methods of studying gaseous emissions except perhaps smelling the guy next door. So that is our problem. The story of diet is far more complicated than what I've shown you. There is the gut microbiome. There is the metabolism in the liver and in the gut. There is the hormones like the GLP hormones, the incretins. We're only beginning to understand diet because diet epidemiology is not enough. In 12,000 people, we've got metabolomics, proteomics, and genomics, and relating it to diet, risk factors, and outcomes. In a few years, we hopefully can shed some light on it.
Yeah, I think since we are running short of time, I thank you, Professor Salim Yusuf, for that wonderful lecture. I think all of us will give a wonderful hand.